Peace, family. Welcome to From Streets to the Statehouse, where we offer an analysis of the Maryland General Assembly that is rooted in Black liberation. I'm your host, Davon Love. This podcast is sponsored by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a grassroots think tank located in Baltimore, Maryland. We advocate for public policy issues that impact the Black community. I serve as its Director of Public Policy. This show is powered by people like you who make it possible for us to do our work. Sustainers are individuals. Sustainers are individuals or organizations who donate to LBS once per month. Your financial offering helps us to carry out our mission and remain independent and unapologetically Black. To become a sustainer, go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. So again, my name is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy. Appreciate you all for being with us once again for another season of Streets to the Statehouse. Again, the purpose of this is to provide a window into the legislature from the lens of Black folks that are interested in liberation. As we say, in a lot of the work that we do, there are different elements and aspects of the work around Black liberation. The work to build institutions, the work to do political education. They're all different rules to build wealth, to do health and wellness. There are a variety of different roles to play as it relates to the work of Black liberation for Black people to reach sovereignty. And LBS, one of our primary roles in that is legislative advocacy towards the importance and toward the goal of Black people being able to exercise sovereignty and freedom in a society structured on racism and white supremacy. So that's the lens that we bring on our analysis of the Maryland General Assembly, which we believe is a part of what makes the work that we do unique, which makes our perspective unique, and why we feel that the work we do is a service to the larger community, particularly Black people of African descent. So again, welcome to our second episode during this 2022 Maryland General Assembly. There's a lot to talk about. For those who were on with us last week, because we normally don't do back-to-back weeks, but last week we spent an entire session, entire podcast talking about our work on cannabis legalization with the reparations focus. We talked about that last week. So please, take some time to, if you didn't get a chance to listen to it live or listen to the recording, please go and listen to it. That work is going to be ongoing throughout session, and you'll hear a lot about that from us because that's going to be one of our major priorities. This particular podcast, though, we're going to talk about some other major legislative issues during the Maryland General Assembly. And we're actually going to have a discussion with a few folks who are working on a variety of issues that are relevant to the work of LBS and relevant to the work, our legislative work that we support down in Annapolis. Before I do that, though, and this is some commentary that I believe ever since we started the podcast, I've given every year, but I think it's important to reiterate it because it's such a central dynamic as it relates to the policymaking frame and environment in Annapolis. And that is, particularly the way that racism and white supremacy operates in the legislature in really particular ways. Because it's easy, I think, to just, we all know, for those who are listeners of this podcast, the standard perspective that LBS comes with, we live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy, right? And so we understand that every aspect of civil society is organized on that fact. But in terms of how it actually shows up in the legislature, in terms of how it's structured and the kinds of policies and the nature of policymaking that happens. And so one of the ways that it shows up, an essential element to the environment of doing legislative work in Annapolis, is in many respects the way, particularly that Baltimore City is represented. Talked a little bit on the last podcast about the conversations about public safety and how those conversations that, as it relates to public safety, is something that often serves as a projection of notions of inherent criminality and pathology onto Black people. And so, there's this thing when I first started doing legislative advocacy, there's this term that I heard people use. It was kind of the unspoken understanding of what Baltimore City represented, which was a black hole, right? This notion that there's a bunch of money that gets spent in Baltimore, there's a lot of help given to Baltimore, and it never gets right, it never gets fixed. And this notion that Baltimore being this kind of perpetual problem. And so often the way in which Baltimore City is represented and the way that it is treated, particularly by legislators in, outside of Baltimore City, away from Baltimore City. Unfortunately, in many cases, the Republicans, for whom are the most responsible for that rhetoric, but we also get some of that from moderate and conservative Democrats as well. And so the reason I wanted to raise this is because one of the questions that I think it's important for us to be asking ourselves about the legislative process is that we're going to talk about some pieces of legislation that really should be no-brainers, right? Pieces of legislation that really shouldn't be controversial, particularly for us in the Black community. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, why are these types of legislation so difficult to get passed in the legislature? And I would argue the answer to that are the notions of inherent pathology and criminality that are projected onto Black people. Even in the conversation around public safety, again, I mentioned in the last podcast, there was an op-ed that I wrote that was published in Maryland Matters, where I criticized Governor Hogan's crime proposal, where he talks about sentence enhancements. This idea that the problem is that there aren't enough, that the sentences are not severe enough, and that if sentences for crimes were increased, then it would deter crime. And the problem with this, there are two major problems with this notion. The first is that it actually flies in the face of the actual evidence as to what deters crime. The National Institute for Justice in May of 2016 released a study, and the outcome of that study shows that it is not the length of the sentence that is the biggest deterrent of crime, but it is the likelihood of getting caught. If we correspond that to the facts about Baltimore City, for instance, police department's clearance rate, right? That in the past year's clearance rate was 40%, which was actually quite high over the past few years. Prior to that, it was 32%. It's been as low as in the 20s in terms of percentage. And so if law enforcement is not even able to apprehend and to figure out who's committing the violent crime, right, in a formal sense, and are able to deliver that to a state's attorney, then it doesn't matter how many sentence enhancements you put on it, because if you can't fundamentally catch the people that are the drivers of violence in our community, those sentences are more likely to be leveraged against people who are not the drivers of violence. People that live in neighborhoods, they may have a firearm for protection, right? Or people that just live in communities that are dangerous communities that are subject to violence, but people that aren't the drivers of violence, for whom incarceration would not be in the service of the community, but will be a detriment to that individual and the communities that folks come from. And so it's important for us to recognize that even though people are saying words, right? So for instance, Senator Justin Reddy, has put out, has basically been the Senate conduit for many of the governor's proposals, and wrote an op-ed where he actually makes a statement that people say that we can arrest our way out of the problem, but he says we should give it a try. The problem is that if you're not able to solve the murders, if you're not able to address the clearance rate, where you're able to solve the murders, apprehend folks, right, then you're not actually arresting the right people. And that this whole notion of repeat violent offenders, people going in and out, is actually a problem on the front end with law enforcement. And so I'll end this portion of the podcast by saying that, one of the things that is clearly ideological is the unwillingness to in a very forthright way, put the responsibility of this problem on law enforcement, because there's such an ideological commitment to law enforcement as this, as an institution that means well to our community, right? And so we just got to be clear about the history of law enforcement. We got to be clear that law enforcement is an institution that has contributed to the detriment of Black people, right? That it's never been an institution that's been committed to the livelihood and quality of life of Black folks. And that if we're serious about addressing the issue of public safety, we actually have to address the issue of police accountability. And often police accountability and public safety are framed as being at odds with each other, when in fact, those things actually intersect. That if we're able to hold law enforcement accountable, able to engage in oversight of law enforcement, it'll force law enforcement to deliver more effectively on the things that they're tasked with delivering on, right? And so often I think this false notion that these two things are mutually exclusive, I think actually takes us away from actually having an effective and reasonable and well-informed conversation about public safety, right? So that's something that LBS is very consistent in making sure that we're clear that our ways of addressing police accountability are also demonstrative of our commitment to public safety, because we understand that that's something that's important to our community. So I'm gonna stop there for a second, and I want to actually get into our first guest, who's here to talk about some police accountability legislation that she wants to put forward. So what I want to do, if she's in the room, is invite our good friend, Delegate Janelle Wilkins of Montgomery County, to be with us this evening. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, appreciate you for coming on. So what I want to do just for a few minutes is just talk about some of the pieces of legislation dealing with police accountability that you're sponsoring. So if you want to just start by just giving us a general synopsis of the bills that you're putting forward.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Thanks again for the opportunity. I think I really appreciated your intro and sort of the background and the stage setting that you just did and the important points that you made, because I do think that in the legislature right now, we're in a bit of a danger zone when it comes to the opportunity to continue to pass police accountability legislation. We did so much last year, and I think that there is sort of a tendency to then pump the brakes in terms of reaching fully what the goal is. And the goal is to ensure that no Black or brown people are shot in the streets, treated unfairly by the police, and that there's full accountability and access to justice for our communities. And we have not achieved that yet. So I think that on top of everything that you just stated, it's so important for us to really keep our pressure up, keep our foot on the gas in terms of continuing to demand accountability. And to that end, one of the bills that I am looking to pass is House Bill 123, and it deals with police pensions and looking at officers who are convicted of crimes in courts. I am not talking about an officer who I think maybe did something, who I have a hunch. I'm talking about officers who are convicted of, in their course of duty, committing a crime, misconduct, perjury, a felony during the course of their work. And what the bill would do is it would allow a process for their pension to be forfeited. And I think that this is something that's absolutely critical, because we are seeing officers, and you're fully aware, I'm sure your guests that are listening are fully aware, officers who have planted guns, planted drugs. The case that actually made me really want to pursue the bill, well, I think it was last year, where an officer said that he saw a gun on a man, and the man was convicted. The man was put in jail. And come to find out, after a more thorough review of the body cam, they realized that the officer could not have possibly have seen what he said he saw, and that officer was convicted of perjury. And the city of Baltimore was interested in recouping the pension from that officer after having to settle for, I think it was $100,000 of, again, taxpayer money that went out to this victim. But there's currently no mechanism to recoup the pension funds, which are taxpayer dollars. So that officer will still receive a check, receive his full pension, even though he literally was convicted of lying in court. And there are too many similar cases. So what this bill does is that it creates a very clear process when an officer is convicted of a crime, a felony crime or perjury or something dealing with truthfulness, for them to lose their pension. So I think that's a really important bill. And the last thing I'll say about it is that I think one of the most egregious examples, although it's not in Maryland, is Derek Chauvin, a name that we unfortunately know too well, who is a convicted murderer who we all saw kill George Floyd in broad daylight. He walks away with his full pension. So I think that that really helps us to see how egregious it is. And this bill should be a common sense one. It did pass the House as part of a package of bills last year. So I'm introducing it in the same form in the House as an individual bill. It didn't make it through the negotiations with the Senate last year when it was passed as part of a different bill. And so we are introducing this one clean and hoping to get full passage this year.
Sounds good. So if you could talk a little bit, because again, I think this is one of those pieces of legislation that really should be a no-brainer. How would you describe the opposition, if you've heard any opposition, and what is the argument for those who would oppose this?
Sure. I think that the opposition partially is a narrative that's out there about the police and accountability being in direct conflict with, the increase in crime that we're seeing across the state, the challenge with hiring officers and officer morale, and all of these things that we are seeing, and sort of the idea we don't want to, push morale back down or hurt recruitment or things like that. But I don't believe that those two things are in conflict. The accountability piece is absolutely critical to public safety. And so that's definitely a narrative that we are up against, is just pushing back on the idea that we can't do anything more on police accountability because we sort of pushed too far and morale is down. I think in general, some of the police unions are maybe concerned around the pension issue. And I think that it's a very simple solution for OFFA to work harder to ensure that officers, are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that there is oversight in these departments. There's no officer who's doing what he or she is supposed to be doing that would be caught up in losing their pension, and that there is a process in the court of law that would determine the pension to be removed. So I do think that the bill is a fair one that has some due process in it. And I hope that we'll be able to push back against any of these narratives and opposition.
So that makes sense. And I think, and it's interesting because you mentioned, kind of what I was referencing in the beginning, around the way that public safety is often juxtaposed or often framed as in opposition to police accountability. And it's one of the things that I've continued to be frustrated with, what I find is not enough public, sophisticated conversations about this particular dynamic. There's a tremendous amount of scare tactics that I think are often used, that are quite penetrating in terms of people's reactions to it. I actually want to read. So this is a study that I often use. It's a lit review and a study that I've used in testimony to describe what I think are some of the societal forces that I think actually play a role in creating the kind of dilemma you mentioned. So this is Tony Weaver in a study from 2016. Research shows that the distorted portrayals of African Americans found in the media cause general antagonism towards African American males, lack of identification or sympathy with African Americans in general, and exaggerated views related to criminality, violence in the African American community. The Phelps found, regardless of conscious reports about racial attitudes, whites are shown to have increased activity in the regions of their brain associated with experiencing fear when they saw unfamiliar African Americans. One study found that United States citizens support harsher laws if those laws are designed to imprison more African Americans. Right. So when I think about just the level of resonance that that notions of reforming law enforcement is counter to public safety, to me, it all is part and parcel of a societal discourse rooted in notions of inherent Black criminality and pathology. And for me, it's the only rationalization why such a measure that you put forward would be something that there would be any opposition to. And the fact that, as you stated, much of the rationale is about the morale of law enforcement, right? As opposed to trying to change it so that there's a more continuity between law enforcement and community, right? That there's a sense that any attempt to push would erode the morale of law enforcement. Let me ask you, because I know you gotta hop off soon. Let me ask you this. You said it passed the House. last year, or was being part of the negotiations with the Senate on the police accountability bills. Are there particular things that you would need people who are interested in this bill? Are there things that you would need people to do in terms of, are there people they need to talk to? Are there people that need to be pressured, particularly on the Senate side? Who do you think people should be talking to? If you want to talk about, just generally, like, what are some of the things that people who want to help, what are some of the ways that they can be helpful?
Absolutely. So I think I would go back to just the idea of continuing to push your members, your state house members, your state senate members around a need for continued police accountability, making sure that it's clear to the people that represent you that we are not done yet. We demand more. We understand that some progress and some movement forward was made last year with the bills that were passed, but that you are demanding to continue to see the passage of true accountability and justice legislation. And specifically in Baltimore, where I think a lot of your audience is based, you all have a lot of leadership in the House and Senate there. And so I think pushing on members who are in leadership in the House and in the Senate in particular, that you'd like to see these bills move is absolutely critical, because you all do have those folks representing you and have a lot of power over what moves forward. So I would definitely say that your voice on these, generally seeing more justice and accountability bills, but specifically to bills like HB 123. It's easy to remember, HB 123. I will be saying that in my hearings, easy as 123. So please, keep that pressure up with the leaders that are representing you in the city for sure.
All right. Well, like I said, pretty straightforward piece of legislation. You've given folks just some general thoughts and some general thinking about, how they can be helpful. Any last words you want to say before you hop on?
Well, first, I just really appreciate this forum where it Streets to the Statehouse is so important to shine a light on what's happening and really break it down. So thank you for the work that you do on this podcast. And I would just quickly flag also my qualified immunity bill that I'm introducing, which basically makes law enforcement officers not able to claim immunity when they commit egregious actions, because it happens time and time again where officer maim, kill, anything taking place that is egregious, and they're able to claim immunity in civil court. And it's very difficult at the state level for victims to be able to get their fair compensation, their access to justice, when an officer said, hey, I don't deny that I did all of that, but I'm immune. So you can't sue me. I can't, be held to justice for that. So I do want to flag that bill, and I don't have the bill number handy. Oh, actually, I'm going to introduce it tomorrow. It doesn't have a bill number yet, but definitely look out for Maryland qualified immunity legislation from me too.
All right. Yeah. When that drops, let us know so we can make sure that we put it, in our updates and we send it out. Wonderful. So, all right. Well, once again, as always, appreciate you for coming through. Thank you for what you do in the Maryland General Assembly. Thank you for being a voice for the community. Thank you for caring about issues that impact Black people. And, we'll see you around.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. All right. So as we transition to our next topic around juvenile justice, just want to say a little bit more about kind of where I started on the podcast, because again, so much of what happens in the legislature, there are, again, Baltimore City is a place where a lot of the media renderings of Baltimore City drives a certain narrative. And so as it relates to youth, another study that I use a lot in testimony is from a study written in 2014, chief researcher Philip Goff. And the report is called The Essence of Innocence, where he actually does a study that basically says that on average, when a person encounters a Black boy, right, as opposed to a white boy, that they often assess the black boy as 6 years older than their actual age, 6 to 8 years older than their actual age, right? So a 14-year-old is being treated like a 21, 22, 20, 21, 22-year-old. And so that, and the essence of innocence, a core part of the approach that the researchers take to this issue of how law enforcement interacts, particularly with black youth, particularly black boys, as opposed to their white counterparts, is to say that the notion of innocence is often not a attitude or a notion that is attributed to black boys. That black boys, in fact, the way they're treated by law enforcement often is absent of the notion of the general innocence that we typically associate with children, right? And so that's a big part of much of the work for juvenile justice reform, because so much of the policy that governs criminal justice in general and the way that black youth are treated in particular are driven, again, by these societal notions of black pathology and criminality that make policies that would otherwise be seen as inhumane, that would make them seem rational. And unfortunately, we're in a legislative context where, yeah, it's overwhelmingly Democratic, right? But unfortunately, I would argue that the Democratic Party generally has not done nearly enough. And if we're talking about issues that directly impact black people, this is one of the places where the Democratic Party continues to fall short and continues to be moderate on an issue that demands really radical action. So what I want to do now is actually invite a couple of brothers on with me. Brother John Comer from Architects of Justice, and the brother Jamal Jones from the co-director of Baltimore Algebra Project. So over the past few years, there's been increased emphasis on juvenile justice reform. There was a Juvenile Justice Reform Council that was created that was supposed to do a deep dive into looking at some of the major criminal justice reform. State Senator Will Smith of Montgomery County, who's now the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate, wrote an op-ed over the summertime where he claimed that juvenile justice would be a major issue in his committee, and being both the first black person to be the chair of that committee, and what he has claimed as a commitment to juvenile justice. I think it's really important that we zero in on this. Again, I wrote a piece a few months ago where one of the things that I continue to highlight is that the Maryland General Assembly has a very low ceiling as it relates to the kinds of policies that get passed. Like, things that should be no-brainers, as I said at the top, are things that haven't been able to be passed. And, we got relatively new leadership, both in the House and the Senate. And I would argue that the work on juvenile justice is a test. It's one of the things I mentioned in the piece. It's another Maryland Matters piece. This is really a test. This is a test of the Democratic Party, right? And its continued statements of commitment to black people. Because what is in the queue in terms of juvenile justice policy, right, needs to be passed, right? Shouldn't be difficult. And to the extent that we're not able to get quality juvenile justice reform is a commentary on the extent to which the Democratic Party actually cares about black youth. So we wonder why so many black youth are disengaged. We wonder why so many black youth, don't feel like they got much support in our community. I think this legislative thrust is a test of the Democratic Party. I take it as such, and I think the community takes it as such. So let me just ask Jenny. I know that was a lot at the top, but I wanted to offer that context because, that's how I feel. But also, I think that's a good context to kind of begin the conversation. So first, let me just ask you both to weigh in on the importance of juvenile justice reform. And I'm gonna start, Brother John. I'm gonna start with you. So just generally, what do you see the importance of juvenile justice reform?
So the importance of it lies in the progress of our communities. So a lot of what we fight every day, whether it's in adulthood, many of these are remnants of the impact of the juvenile justice system. So there's a lot of trauma that we all know happen in our communities. And most of it, if not all of it, is driven by a system and different parts of the system. And the juvenile justice system is something that has been targeting our Black and brown bodies as well, male, increasingly female, and it's causing even more of a type of trauma that we have to end up trying to fix in grown adults, and it's targeting these young folks in a way that is continuously driving home the message that they're not important in this life and they just belong in prison. I'll stop there and just, let Jamal pick it up.
Yep. So it looks like Jamal may have dropped off for a second. So, when he comes back in, let me add, and you can respond to this. I think in addition to that, when we think about I think a lot about, I've talked a lot this podcast about the media portrayals.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about the way that the media portrays the youth. So we think about a lot of the hysteria we see in public discourse about, young people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I know that I remark about all the time is that there's not nearly enough coverage about some of the positive things youth are doing, right? That they're the most visible when they're doing the things, when you see images or renderings of young people doing things that trigger a lot of the kind of racialized stereotypes. So how important, how much, just in the work that you've done, how important is that aspect of it, right? In terms of getting people to the place where they understand the importance of these policy changes.
So, people can't imagine sometimes what's being said about you down inside of a state capitol or state house or state senate buildings. There are people who are making laws who have bought into the stereotypes. They may know they're stereotypes, don't even care that they're stereotypes. And a lot of these laws are just pure out based in hatred, just like this law that we're talking about, this interrogation bill, right? And so who in their right mind thinks it's okay to allow such authority who can be in charge of incarcerating you for much of your teenage years? Who thinks that's okay for them to be allowed to just approach a young person in the street and begin to question them and then take them downtown or convict them without any lawyer, without any guardian present or anything like that? And these laws are just the targets of our neighborhoods, of our communities. So it's very important for us to go down there, to not be intimidated by the walls, also to understand that our ancestors built that while we were hostages, while we were slaves. There can be a weird energy in the building. Be prepared for that, but be prepared to go down and fight, because without us showing up, that appears that we may not care. And I know, and you know, and everyone knows that that's not true.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Jamal, just want to go back to you and just talk just generally about why juvenile justice policy reform is important. Just generally, just speaking on that.
So I was listening and I'm thinking, and I love always having conversations with you guys because I always start thinking about stuff. I'd say for me to sum it up is probably two things, or rather big picture and little picture. So on the big picture side of things, I'd say that it really comes down to what John was talking about in terms of impact on the community. And that doesn't just mean impact for outcomes. That also means incomes for potential like procedures and moving forward. That means impact for like generations going forward. That also means impact for like communities' ability as youth transition into adulthood to connect to these systems in meaningful ways, and to like divert from the culture that we have right now where people are trying to disconnect it and discontent with the public kind of consumption that they have of public safety. The other side of that, I'd say on the smaller impact side, is the trust side with the legislators in terms of juvenile justice reform as a framework. Maryland is still a southern state. So like most of the policies here were created under the context of like southern culture and southern understandings and connections and relations to Black people. So much of the way the policies are already created here, whether it's adult or youth, but since we specifically pertain to youth, like a lot of that is already rooted in a lot of what you were speaking about in terms of the framework of like anti-Blackness and and racism. And so saying that to say, a lot of these legislators, to your point, will take policies that seem like they no-brainers and turn it into all of this other stuff. And to me, the impact comes down to trust with legislators. Because if folks are running around saying things like juvenile justice is central and like actually trying to embody that or move legislation that's meaningful through the legislature, then what that would really look like is policies like charging youth as adults, policies like youth interrogation. They would just kind of like, those are things that are afforded or freedoms or protections rather that are afforded to citizens in general. It doesn't make sense that they're not for youth. And it's one of the things that happens continually across the spectrum where their youth are overlooked in terms of policy making. And traditionally what just happened, what is made for adults tends to be made for young people. And this is an attempt to kind of like redo that and have a situation that is created so that young people can interact with that system in a way that protects them and also allows for the system to work. But what we're seeing is the resistance to change coming from this southern culture where traditionally this piece of policy being used by law enforcement and people who work with law enforcement to justify their jobs and their budgets.
So before we go much further, let's talk about the specific pieces of legislation. So y'all can kind of cover how y'all wish. Just tell the people about what the bills are, what they do, just so that people get a sense of the specifics that we're working with. So I'll let either one of y'all pick who takes that.
I'll start with the youth interrogation bill. I believe that's Senate Bill 56, I think, 53. Senate Bill 53, House Bill 269. And we've been working on this bill for about 2 sessions. Originally, it was getting caught in the House. So people need to understand that just because a bill doesn't pass does not mean that it couldn't pass, right? Like, so at the end of the day, bills have a schedule. There are leaders within each House and Senate that set the schedule for the bill to be heard, right? If that leader does not set for that bill to be heard, that's another way of blocking a bill, right? So now we're in the Senate, and this interrogation bill will pretty much say that police officers cannot interrogate youth without a parent or a guardian or a lawyer being on site. Now, as we've been talking about the entire time, that's a no-brainer. Like, because we have to protect youth, and there's so many studies out here that show that the development of the youth brain is not at the point of an adult brain. Now, me being an adult, I still would get nervous if the police pulled me over right now, tonight, right? And there's still trauma behind that. And on top of that, there's trauma from my childhood of engaging with police that have led me to continue to have this trauma into my adulthood. So like, these are just some of the basic reasons that you could think of. We don't even need to have research in order to get these bills passed. But what is happening, or what we don't want to happen this session, is that this bill gets caught up and it doesn't get called to committee, and they don't vote on it. And then here we are going another year allowing police in the state of Maryland to just pull up youth at any time they want, talk to them, get them on record, convict them if they need to or want to. And we have to know that with juvenile policies, we're the ones that's being targeted. Of course, it's meant for everyone, but we also know that everyone doesn't get encounters with the police at a young age. Black communities are over policed every day. They parade the block. So this is just something that we are doing to protect our youth, right? Like we protect our youth in many different ways. We also have to show up in Annapolis or on YouTube. They're showing the hearings on YouTube. So you don't have to go to Annapolis. You can tune in, listen to it live, listen to what they're saying, call your legislator. Figure out who that is, contact any of us on this call, and we'll help you figure out who your legislator is because it matters. This is the process, and this is why we're here.
So real quick, just for the people listening, so youth interrogations, what that bill would do, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it will require law enforcement before they engage in a custodial interrogation that there has to be an attorney present and requires the parents to be notified. Currently, there is no such requirement for parents to be notified, and there is no such requirement for an attorney to be present. The reason why that's important for folks who remember the docuseries When They See Us, right, where you had young youth who were interrogated by law enforcement and made statements because, as Brother John said, if you're a child, even if you're an adult, right, and an officer is telling you what you must do, if you don't have an attorney present, a young person's not going to know what's in their best interest to say to that particular law enforcement official. And so that has in many cases resulted in false confessions or forced confessions that have led for people to spend a long times in jail. And we don't actually have to go to New York for the exonerated five to see that. There was actually a group of gentlemen in the early 80s who actually ended up being exonerated recently as a result of a new unit that was created within the state's attorney's office, the Conviction Integrity Unit, which actually allowed for the brothers who were incarcerated for forced testimony to come out of prison. So a part of what this policy is aiming to do is to ensure that young people are not making the kinds of confessions that would lead them to spend time and be incarcerated. That nobody in their right mind should want that. So that's in terms of just more explanation on that policy. All right, what other bills?
The other big bill this session is Senate Bill 165, and that's basically the charging youth as adults and ending that process. So basically, there's a set of stuff that you can do as a young person in the state of Maryland that is considered so egregious that if you do these things, you are no longer like you stop being 14 or whatever age you are, and you are automatically treated and operated with as if you are like 18 and above. That includes housing with adults, that includes like just general lack of services or whatever, and also there's like spaces where there aren't services. The goal of this bill would basically to end that process so that young people aren't given the space of pushed down the juvenile justice system in a way where they're automatically charged as adults. So like in my own personal experience, I have a brother who actually was introduced to the criminal justice system while we were teenagers, and as a result of it, he was charged as an adult for armed robbery. So we aren't even talking about always stuff like capital murder, or we aren't always talking about things like rape. Like imagine a word bank, and there's a list of stuff in there that basically you can do that automatically changes you from being 12 to 18. And quite frankly, there's a whole lot of data that supports that that's not true. We can see that you're not, and that's probably more harmful than helpful in most instances. And so the goal of this bill is to try and rectify that. And the cross-file for that is House Bill 294.
And so just in terms of additional commentary about that, because I think and this I'll pose it as a question and then say something about it and invite you to say more. Because there's some people when they look at many of the charges that are in there, right, and they see first degree assault and murder and all that, and so a lot of the knee-jerk reaction is like, why would I want to treat a murderer, you know what I'm saying, like a child, right? So there are a few things that I want to say I think are very important for people who are listening this to keep in mind. First, we're talking about charges, right? So we're not talking about people who've been convicted, right? We're talking about charges, right? And so that's important because particularly in as I was talking to Delegate Wilkins earlier in the podcast about the way conversations about public safety are being elevated and used, right? And as a way to push back against some of the policing stuff, I think that counts here. So that's the first thing. And secondly, and I want to make sure that I have this right, which is that the idea is that it starts, what we want it to start in the juvenile system, and that it can be waived up to the adult system, but it has to at least start in the juvenile system. Do I have that right?
Correct. So as I was saying before, there's currently, like, if you just to think about it, folks, there's a word bank box that don't include just rape and murder. It's a bunch of other stuff in there that automatically pushes you through that process. And the psychology on that is like criminal, like for that particular perspective. And what this bill aims to do is remain kind of hold steady the like youth aspect of it and treat youth as youth until it's deemed necessary. Whereas right now, an officer can arbitrarily just decide that you are an adult and treat you that way, and that then changes the trajectory of a person's life.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, one of the other things that I would ask you to speak to as well, because a part of the impact of charging a young person as an adult is that what it means is that many of the services that are not available on the adult side, that are only available on the juvenile side, right? So in addition to if you're charging a youth as an adult, these are children who aren't getting access to those services that you get on the juvenile side and would be exposed to adults. Now there are policies around separating them, but if they're in the same facility, it's quite possible that they'll come across adults, and how terrible that is developmentally for a child.
Correct.
So I just wanted to make sure the listeners were aware of that, right? It's it's really important that people are clear about why it's important, right? It's important given the fact that these are children. They should get access to those services. They've only been charged, not convicted, right? And so the idea of automatically charging youth as adults, in fact,
it takes away their innocence again. It's like, you have a mind frame or a perspective that with certain types of children, you allow officers to decide that they are no longer children. And that's not a framework that white folk would operate with their own children. These policies are in place for a different set of folks. And I'd argue it's us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's talk about, and John, you started with this in terms of talking about strategy.
Yeah.
So this point that I'm making around things, policies like this being no-brainers, actually mentioned this policy last General Assembly, and another piece that I wrote where I was actually very critical of the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Luke Clippinger, who I've had, pleasant conversations with and very honest conversations with in the past, where I've kind of discussed what I find to be the limitations of his approach, and just made it very plain, in terms of the way in which, particularly looking at these policies through the lens of a conservative prosecutor, right? He's his day job. He's an Anne Arundel County prosecutor, right? Anne Arundel County tends to be much more conservative, than even, Baltimore City, certainly, even Baltimore County. And so that approach lends itself to the kinds of policies that we're actually trying to undo. Now, what I find to be something, and I want to give him credit, is that, and I think it was you, John, that mentioned this, that it passed the House last session, right? So we're able to get it past the House. So I want to give him credit publicly, right? Because there are lots of legislators that would have something like that written about them and would decide, okay, I'm just not letting it out. You know what I'm saying? But I want to give him credit to say that that was something that actually passed the House, right? It's my sense that the House continues to be generally in a position of support, right? So that's kind of what I understand. And so the problem last session was getting it through the Senate, right? So that was the problem last session. So Adam just pulled up so that was the piece from last year where I talked about race neutrality, which is often the cover that is used. Like none of the policies that we talked about in the context of this conversation around law enforcement or juvenile justice, we've not talked about policies that say Black people, but the way that they're implemented, disproportionately impact Black people. So we're talking about strategy. The Senate was the problem last year. And so, we need the community to help in pushing forward and pressuring both the Senate and the House to make sure it comes out again, and the Senate to make sure that it comes out. So let me ask y'all this first. Is there any other information about the posture that these bills are in both chambers? So, so if we're talking about youth interrogations, what's the sense of where that is on either side? If either of you have that intel, where it stands on where the youth charges adults, like where that potentially stands on either side, and then I would say also if you want to make a comment about who do you find to be the most vigorous opposition. Right. So if you're not, so if you don't have any information about specifics within each chamber, just generally, where's the opposition coming from?
Yeah, you shooting first with me.
Go ahead.
All right, so this is what it is, right? Like on the Senate side, I'm gonna just keep it a beam. Well, with all these committees, right? John was like mentioning it before. The way that they all work, it's a chair and a vice chair, and basically them two together decide what gets on a voting block or like the voting list, and that like voting list is what determines what will come out or not come out of committee. Basically, what's happening is we need on the Senate side for the chair, Will Smith, to bring out like to call that specific piece of legislation, which is the interrogation piece, to a vote, particularly because of the timeline that we're on. We want to make sure that like this gets out and is able to be passed and put on the governor's desk and able to be like moved, partially because last year it was like in a situation where it didn't move out. It moved out of the House, but didn't move in the Senate. And in the context of like last year to this year for the House, what I'm hearing is that basically the House wants to wait on the Senate. So we are all waiting on Will to determine the fate of whether or not young people in Maryland, particularly young Black people, are going to have the opportunity to have like legal counsel and parental contact before having to engage with the police in an interrogation setting. The other person that is key to that is the vice chair, I'd say, which is a guy named Senator Wallstriker. Both of those two in general have the collective capacity to bring that up for a vote at any given point. They really have that decision to make on their own. But what we need folks to do on this side is try and get in touch with those folks and push them to actually put that on the voting list sooner rather than later, so that we can make sure that we don't run into any hiccups later on down the session. And I guess to speak to that last point about what other potential obstacles, crazy thing is it sounds like people want to pit these two bills against each other, right? Like if like in terms of like political horse trading, these two pieces of legislation are both common sense pieces of legislation that should just be passed as is without any amendments. However, what it sounds like might be the case is that some of the legislators may be backdoor trying to have some conversation around the tone of, if you want youth interrogation, you got to give up youth charges adults, and if you want youth charges adults, you got to give up youth interrogation. Which is crazy because both of these things are vital for our communities. We spend a bunch of time working on these both as like organizations and individuals in space, and it's ridiculous that that type of environment exists when and is the impediment to having this kind of policy change. And it really speaks to the nature of the legislators that you were speaking to before, in terms of like this anti-blackness and this notion of like pathologizing black boys altogether, where it's like, if I make these decisions very rashly or real quickly, it's a bunch of people who will be mad at me, and it's because I'm gonna make their jobs harder. Particularly the prosecutors were the folks in there loudest last session, and like law enforcement, around the ideas of what happens if we give them too much time. So much as to say, like, if you give black children too much time to think about what they're going to talk about, or if they talk to their counsel, that whatever is going on, they won't be able to land the case, which really lends itself to your article about the ineffectiveness of law enforcement to do their jobs.
So the bill is in the Senate, and it's been referred to committee. So there's a first reading, and on every reading, people are able to testify and give how they feel about the bill, however you feel. I think it's important for people to know that outside of Baltimore, like so the two people that Davon showed, Will Smith and Wall Striker, they should be contacted by everyone. But it's also important to know that both of them are coming from Montgomery County. And so if you have family, friends, and anyone in Montgomery County, you should also reach out to them, ask them to contact them directly, and to push this bill through SB 53 or the Juvenile Interrogation Act as is. Because many times bills get the committees and they try to amend it and they try to weaken the bill and water it down. And there's no reason to water this down. It's, we keep saying it's a no-brainer. So be sure to know that we're not against this bill. We are for this bill. This bill needs to be passed. And these heads of these committees need to be contacted.
So a few things. So first, so let me one of the things that Jamal, you mentioned was about who these legislators capitulate to, right? Which relates to what some of the stuff that I've been saying earlier in the podcast. So this is concept, and again, I feel like this is a concept I mention every year, but it's relevant. We call them purple districts, right? So we're in a state where it's a Democratic Party supermajority. There's certain districts where it's actually competitive. So most large portions of Maryland are heavily Democratic. The generals essentially what determines who represents that district. But there are a few districts around the state where it's competitive in the general. And one of the things that I've criticized Democratic Party leadership for in the past is capitulating to the purple districts. And so, so for people who may not be familiar with what I mean exactly. So those purple districts, so those are districts where, places like the Towson area, right? So that District 42, right, which was the Senator Jim Brochen, was a Democrat. Now it's a Republican, Chris West. There is in East Towson in Baltimore County, Kathy Klausmeyer, who's actually, this is, as I understand it, her last term, her last year, who had a competitive race with a Republican in the last election. So that, so for people who are familiar with the Baltimore County area, that gives you a sense of the places where you have these purple districts. And the importance of them is that they often can be liberal on some things, but tend to be conservative on issues of public safety and criminal justice reform.
Yes.
Right. So these are the places where folks tend to be most adamantly against a lot of these issues. And so, Jamal, to your point, one of the things that tends to happen in terms of party leadership, because these chairs of the committee, this goes back to what John said, chairs are appointed by the presiding officer. So the Senate president selects the chairs in the Senate, Speaker of the House selects the chairs in the House. And so, so they operate as a machine. They talk, when we talk about leadership, we're talking generally about chairs and high-ranking people within the party. And so the party's often thinking about elections, right? We have an election coming up. So they're often thinking about constituencies they feel like, and they're governing to the purple districts. That I think has a lot to do with a bunch of the resistance to these kind of policies that are no-brainers, right? So that's why it's even more important for people to make sure that you're active in reaching out to your legislators. You know what I'm saying? Because they're going to need to feel the pressure from this side, because they're certainly feeling the pressure from the other side. The other side are making the calls and making a big fuss of it and using the scare tactics and the racist caricatures of Black youth. And so that's going to be really important. So I just want to expound upon that because that's something on those podcasts we talked about in previous sessions that actually impacts, most of the legislation that we've worked on. And in terms of a specific legislative question, because Jamal, you mentioned the notion of bills being pit against each other, right?
Yep.
And normally one of the problems in the legislature is that level of horse trading is common. And to John's point, there's often an attempt to amend legislation to water it down, right? So let me make sure I'm clear, just, with both of y'all, being able to just be on the record as saying this. We want both bills, right? Am I correct?
Correct.
And we want both bills unamended.
Correct.
Correct.
Right. So that's important for the public to know, so that when they reach out when folks who are listening reach out to your legislator, right? No amendments. We want 2 clean bills, no amendments, right? Youth Interrogations Act, and we'll stop the automatic charging of youth as adults. No compromise, clean bills through both houses, right? So that's important because that horse trade you're talking about is something that, again, is common in the legislature. And oftentimes what that does is that it creates an environment where people feel like they got to pick between the two. So I'm actually glad to hear y'all say that, you want a clean, no compromise. That's going to be important for people who are supported to be able to hear y'all say. So y'all both have talked about, some of the way, in terms of contacting their legislators, in order to make sure the proper pressure is put on them. And we've talked a little bit about some of the opposition. One of the other entities is the Maryland Association of State's Attorneys. So Scott Schellenberger, who is often the person who is testifying against a lot of these kinds of policies, he actually has a race for state's attorney in Baltimore County. He's a Baltimore County state's attorney. He's actually being challenged by Robbie Leonard, who I understand to be a more progressive prosecutor. So I wanted to make sure I include that as something else for people to pay attention to. What are some other things that you all think is really important for the public to know about these bills or the process that these bills are going through? Because again, we hear generally about juvenile justice. We hear generally the kind of fear mongering and whatnot. What are some of the things that you want people to know about these bills that you think is going to be really important for people who are supporters, people who want these bills to pass? What are some things that you all think is important for them to know, either about the bills or the process?
Go for it.
I think people need to know when we talk systemic trauma, these bills are like the foundation to a lot of our pain, right? Like, so when our family members, little brothers, little sisters, older brothers, older sisters, sons, daughters, go off to be incarcerated, it's allowed first by a bill that goes into law. So I think a lot of times we have so much going on in our life that it's kind of easy to write things off and say, like, I don't have time for that. That doesn't matter. I'm not going to pay attention to it. But sometimes part of the reason why we don't have time for that is we're so caught up trying to unwork some of the results or some of the effects of the system. Like, those problems, our problems many times are directly created by the system. So in order to fight, we have to first identify what the true enemy is. And so at the end of the day, these bills, some of them good, some of them bad, many of them are no different than somebody, walking up to your stoop and taking 5 fingers across the face of you or your family. That's what's happening. But it's happening in such more of a violent way. But it's quiet, right? But it comes about later in life. And so that's why we spend our time here. But we're also like, we're not doing this because we think it works. We're doing this because we know it works. We've seen it work. We fought bills. We've defeated bills. We've passed bills. We know that when a certain amount of people show up, it pushes people to vote. Certain people don't like, I'll say this, certain legislators don't want you to know how they're voting. Certain legislators don't want you to know or the public to know their stance, even though it's public information. When it comes down to it, if the media jumps on it or the general public, we go down there and make noise about it. A lot of folks don't want to be known to be voting against or for some of these bills. So at the end of the day, we have to play the game of exposing people, and Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle has done a wonderful job at doing that. And so, and it's a beautiful thing that they're using that platform to help organize the rest of the organizers in the city and the state to fight this stuff, because it's that serious. It might not be your kid today, but it could easily be your kid tomorrow. And we have to know that.
Yes, sir.
And I just say for folks just getting involved in it, I wrote down my quick points, so I ain't gonna hold us that long. So the first thing is don't get spent. That's the main thing. Anytime the bill go into, if I ask you for a number 5 medium with a Sprite, and you come back to me with a number 3 grande with a Diet Coke and be like, this the same thing. No, it's not. You wouldn't let nobody else do that to you.
That's right.
That's what happens with these bills when they go to committee and people change stuff around the horse trade. You be out here thinking that you got what you're looking for, and you really got spent. Don't get spent. And that happens when we don't pay attention, which leads to the second thing, lock in. Like, I hear comedians talk about it all the time, particularly Black comedians, about how focused the Black community was on politics and CNN when Donald Trump was in office. But like that level of, yo, this the playoffs, I need to lock in, yo, I got bets on who gonna vote on what. That's what need to happen so that all eyes is on them at a level that they feel like they can't get away with nothing. And to that last point, the Maryland General Assembly got a website, because right now session is digital. Normally people got to drive all the way down to Annapolis or walk or scooter or whatever. I've been talking to some of the squeegee boys and some of the dirt bike guys and even some of the pedal bike guys. Shout out to all of my guys up here. But about trying to get them to do a ride out down there when it like session does open up, because we really do need people to go down there. But luckily, because of the Rona and all of her variant cousins, we basically got a virtual session where people can log in. So on the website, you can go in and create an account. You can track the bills yourself. You can be able to see what you're looking for. You can see where the bill is. You can even get everybody's contact info. In fact, secret plug, the site that we were showing in terms of where the bills were on the screen, that is the Maryland General Assembly website. So you'll be able to have all the same types of information that we all have and be able to see where things are. And quite frankly, hit us all up so that we all stay in the struggle together. Because I tell you, I'm 30. My brother, I was 16 when my brother got charged as an adult. That's still the case now. And so there's a lot of my other brothers who may not come from my nuclear family who going through the same situation, that until we lock in and don't let ourselves get spent, we're going to keep letting ourselves get spent. And the crazy thing is, it's mostly Democratic Party leadership that's spending us.
Youth interrogation is youth intimidation. Like that's what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and again, we can't stress it enough. These are bills that really are no-brainers. And the fact that we got pushed like this says everything we need to know. So on that note, though, in terms of getting it out to the public, so one thing that the public should know is that the Senate, so voting sessions, Jamal mentioned voting sessions earlier. So before the pandemic, you can go to Annapolis. Anybody can go to Annapolis. You can go in, committee hearings, delegation meetings, right? So you can go to any of those, show up. One of the places that I think is one of the most important places are the voting sessions, right? Those voting sessions are where legislators actually talk about the bills that's going to get out of committee. Because normally when a bill comes out of committee, it's all, in many cases, it's a done deal, right? There are floor fights, right, where people will put amendments on the floor. But a lot of times when something comes out of committee, it's pretty much a done deal. And so the voting sessions in the committee are particularly important. And one of the things that happened last session was that those voting sessions were streamed virtually, right? They continue to be so today now, but the Senate is actually going to move to in-person voting sessions, particularly in the Judiciary Committee. They're going to move to in-person. And so, a group of us are going to go down to Annapolis on Friday to be in the voting session. We ultimately want, there's some people working on this, trying to get the Senate to make sure they continue to stay streamed, because as both John and Jamal mentioned, that's a way that people who can't come down to Annapolis can stay involved, to stay informed, can be watching what's going on. And if we don't have people watching, I know for a fact, just given the years that I've been doing legislative advocacy, it makes a huge difference just having somebody in the room. Like having somebody in the room makes a huge difference in terms of how they behave. So we want them to be streamed. So if folks want to come down to Annapolis, the voting session on the in the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee start at 9:30 typically. Now it's all the discretion of the chair, so the chair can change it. If anything different happens, we'll surely let people know on our website. But 9:30 in the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate building. So we'll be down there to watch. Hopefully we can again pressure them to make sure that the voting session stays streamed. But we'll be there. It's open to the public, so they can't tell you to leave. You're entitled to be there and watch. And so I think it's really helpful because people get to really see like how these discussions happen. I don't know what bills are going to be on the vote list. We're not sure. We don't know. But just generally, it's good to be there and be seen. So just wanted to put that out there as another way for people to be involved. All right. So look, we coming up on time. Any other last comments y'all want to make before we shut down for the night?
Yep, I was ready to throw mine out there just real quick. Along them lines of like not getting spent and like staying along the like path with this. In reality, what our folks have been faced with when it comes to these types of policies, usually like the ultimatum is like get a little bit of something or take all or nothing. And the problem is for decades, we have taken a little bit of something. And the problem is that mess up. I was about to cuss, but that mess us up a lot more than saying, no, that's not what we need. Don't give me that. This is what I need, and this is what I'm taking. And I think the sooner we as a community of people who care about our people start to move with that position, we're going to have better outcomes. Because I tell you this, going to the legislature feels often like asking someone to go shopping and giving like $100. Like someone says, go take here's $100. I want you to go buy a pair of shoes. It's like, that's the something is better than nothing. We should probably not take the $100 because we're not going to be able to produce what we want to produce. And at the end of the day, what ends up happening is people go back and say you wasted the money because you're not even using what you spent it on. And similarly, we have other outcomes with policies. And so I really want people to stay the course, don't get spent, and make sure that we locked in because them eyes is important.
Yeah, and do some of the things we suggested. We talked about contacting your people that in Silver Spring, Montgomery County, asking them to contact Will Smith, Wall Striker, asking them to support the bill because they have a bit more power than other legislators do. They had the power to block it. They had the power to pass it. Do these things. We're not just up here saying it like clockwork. These are the things that's going to work. There's a lot of organizing that goes down in Baltimore City. There's organizing that goes down in Prince George's County, but we're not it's not that much organizing going on in Montgomery County. So like, if you know people across the state, be sure to spread this message, share the podcast, all of the podcasts, because this is about informing people. We ain't just up here to talk, to sound good. The messages of, you did well, that's cool and all, but we not doing well. We sick. And the only way you get over sickness is you fight it. You fight it. So it's been a pandemic going on. We've been in the middle of, we've been getting locked up. It's time for us to actually wake up even more, stand up for our kids. They're trying to take our babies. Why do we have to convince them not to approach our babies? Our babies.
Yes, sir. Well, look, I appreciate both of y'all for being with us tonight. Like I said, we encourage people to share this widely. These are bills that LBS are definitely going to support. So, as we put out updates, we're going to lean on y'all and others to, get the word out to the community to help put some pressure to make sure that these bills move in the way they need to. So again, appreciate y'all for being with us tonight. Jamal Jones from the Algebra Project, John Comer, Architects of Justice. Thank y'all for being with us tonight. So just in terms of some closing comments for the podcast, one of the things that I wanted to mention a little earlier, Jamal mentioned something about the fact that the House says that they want the Senate to move it. One of the things, move it first before the House moves it, because they moved it last year. It was the Senate that was the obstacle. One of the things that I want to say is that, really the beauty of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle being that we're powered by the community, right? We have, over 600 people that are sustainers who provide us the resources for us to be unapologetically Black and independent. And I mentioned that in the context of the comment about the Senate moving first. It's important that we're clear that, we need to move as free Black people and to put pressure on these legislators. A lot of times we're socialized to cower, we're socialized to feel like, well, what's the formal process? I got to make sure that I'm doing everything the right way. And look, it's important to understand the process and the procedure, but it's important for people to just speak up and let their people who's supposed to represent them, let them know what you think, right? And so we want to put pressure on both sides, right? The House and the Senate, right? To move on this as quickly as possible, because what's important is that these bills move without the amendments on them and that both bills move, right? So it's just really important that we're clear that bold advocacy makes a difference. And that one of the things that continues to be a criticism that LBS has is about the way in which the Democratic Party infrastructure, Democratic Party leadership, both whether it's elected leadership, whether it's the party apparatus, that these are institutions that have demonstrated time after time that the extent to which they do things in the interest of Black people is to the extent of the pressure that's put on them. Like the Democratic Party and Black people is an exploitative relationship, where the Democratic Party benefits a whole lot more from our patronage and support than Black people benefit from us being a captured electorate within the Democratic Party. And that's important because, again, these are pieces of legislation that should be no-brainers. These are things that aren't tremendously complicated. And if we're talking about the kinds of policies that disproportionately impact Black people, these are policies that do exactly that. And so it's important that we challenge our legislators who claim to be representing the best interest of Black people, the best interest of Maryland. It's important that they are challenged to champion these kinds of legislations really as the price of admission to any recognition of being a fighter for justice. And so I just wanted to reiterate that, because these bills are going to be bills that, especially in light of the frenzy around public safety and some of the caricatures of Black pathology that are used to justify the kind of hysteria around public safety that frame solutions to these problems as if Baltimore City or Black people are some misbehaving child and all we need is some strong patriarchal figure to make us behave, right? It's disrespectful to all the Black people in our community that are doing work every day to address violence in their community, right? There's nobody in the legislature, particularly representing those jurisdictions outside of Baltimore City and other jurisdictions experiencing spikes in violence. There's nobody that wants this problem addressed more than Black people who are in these communities and advocates like myself and others that are advocating on all these issues that you've heard tonight. There's nobody that wants to enter that violence more than us. But I don't see, Justin Reddy in Sandtown, Winchester. I don't see them offering help and support to the folks in the communities. Yeah, they helped pass some bills that provided some additional resources that LBS and others worked on. That contributed some resources to community-based anti-violence programs, but that came in light of pressure to make them do it. But in terms of really getting to know the people who are on the ground doing the work, I don't hear about them coming down and wanting to acclimate themselves to the community. So I say all this because, again, this public safety frame is going to be used against these kinds of policies. And it's these kinds of policies that create the kind of relationship that we need with institutions like law enforcement and others that are going to be important to actually addressing public safety. But more importantly, being able to stop the abuse and violations of our humanity that happen as a result of automatically charging youth as adults or not providing the protections for young people when they're engaging law enforcement. So it's important for us to pressure our legislators to do what needs to be done. LBS will continue to bring you the perspective, bring you a perspective rooted in Black liberation, understanding we live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy, and what is needed is Black autonomous political pressure that is rooted in the base of our community, speaking up unapologetically and challenging this system as an affirmation of our humanity in this larger system of domination and colonialism. So with that, I know I just kind of went off a little bit, but just wanted to leave you with that. Again, I'm Davon, Director of Public Policy Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Again, make sure that you become a sustainer. The only way we can talk like this is because of the support we get from you all, and if you can't give a sustainer, join our emailing list so you can contact your legislator. I know it don't sound like a lot. It don't sound like a big deal, just contacting your legislator. But when I'm doing legislative work in Annapolis, those calls is what gives us the ability to push for a lot of these policies. So thank you for the continued support for LBS. If you're not a sustainer, become a sustainer. It allows us to be able to be as bold, to be as direct, to be as forthright about our advocacy. So continue to support Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Again, this is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy. You all have a good evening.